Hello, once again. I'm going to try this again. The previous attempt to read chapter 20 here, Last Days of the People, was not surprisingly, it was interrupted by my mother's arrival. I knew she was going to be arriving about 3 p.m., and I waited too long. I knew the chapter was going to take about 45 minutes, and I started at 2:45, and sure enough, I had to stop after about 15 minutes, but I actually feel better today, and so it's probably going to be a better reading. I'll start again from the beginning. And here we go. Chapter 20, Last Days of the People. Toward the end of August, we left the Inukhak to their lonely vigil and turned back to Windy Bay. The forerunners of the herds had already preceded us, and Andy's work at the Deer's Way was at an end. As for me, the strange lands about Ankuni had told me all they knew, for they could speak only with dead voices. I was ready to return to the living voices of the Ihalmuit. The journey home was uneventful, and Ahoto was happy to find that his father's dire predictions had not yet been fulfilled. The people still lived, though they were hungry, for they were without shells. We supplied them with what we could spare, and that was most of what we had, for our time in that land was almost at an end. There was a month still to run. This we spent with the deer and with the people, and as always, when these two things are together, the time was happy, and there was contentment in the hearts of all men. It is pleasant now to remember that those last days in the land were happy ones. In the time when the deer were hurrying south to the forests to evade the impending onslaught of winter, we too made our farewells to the barrens. The nights had already grown long, the days had grown brief, and the season of Kyla's wrath was upon us. We saw little of sunlight or starlight. The gray cloud scud, raced in from the east, and the roof of the world was so close above us that we could stand on the dull moss of the ridges and feel the chill wraiths of the driven mists in our faces. The land was dying, and it was time for us to return to our own world. Our canoe, old now with the weight of her journey, lay with her scrofulous sides on the shore. Beside her was a meager pile of supplies which must see us out of the land. It was raining, a fine penetrating haze, as cold and dismal as the gray sweat on the face of a corpse, hung over us. Ahoto and Utek came to help us stow our sparse dunnage against the rough, splintering ribs of the canoe. Ahoto was smoking his little stone pipe, a tiny and shapely object of semi-translucent stone, neatly and artistically bound with the brass of an old cartridge case. I said goodbye to him in the white man's way, and after we had shaken hands, he took the pipe from his mouth and, without speaking, handed it to me. It was a trivial gift in farewell, and yet, how trivial was it? I knew how the pipe had come down from a century that is gone, for it was the pipe of Eliatutna, Hoton's father. It had seen more of the land and more of the things in the land than any man living had seen or would see. It was to have gone with Ahoto into his grave, to remain with him as a familiar thing in the eternity he sought at the end of his days. Now it would go with me instead, out of the land, to lie warm and smoldering in the palm of my hand as I remembered the things I needed to say if the voices of the Hamlet were to be heard in the world of the Kablanais. I think Utek, my song cousin, was crying a little, but perhaps it was only the film of moisture which lay over all our faces as the cold east wind drove the spume low over the hills. Why, after all, should he cry? The white men were leaving the land, leaving it to the people, and he would not return, and we would not return, for in the time that can be measured, it is a handful of years. In a handful of years, nothing would remain to draw us back to the Great Plains. The current gripped our canoe, and as we passed down to the mouth of the river, I looked back, but I saw nothing worth remembering in that last glance. Thick mists obscured the ghost hills and the dark crest of the cabin by the shore. So I turned and looked forward as the old canoe made her way down the long arm of the bay and to the open waters of the mighty Newelton. For nearly a week we coasted the shores of Newelton until we came to a maze of bleak little islands crowding the northernmost bay of the lake. Here, after much searching, we found the contorted passage which leads to the bay of the Tlewiaza, the great fish river which flows to the sea. Once on that river, we were too busy to think again of the land of the little hills. The canoe leapt, shied, and started like a frightened beast as she took the first rapid. We shot out at its foot and then paused to still our frightened hearts before we went on down the river that has been run by no more than 3 or 4 white men in all time. After the briefest of respites, the rapids roared at us again. I keep thinking about, I don't know exactly what's on his mind as he keeps referring to that. It seems important to him to say when something has been done never or almost never by white men. And I don't know if it's for the benefit of the audience who would find that interesting, or if it's some undercurrent of mild race superiority in him. But I continually find it interesting. Tlewiaza is the only river running from the land of the people to the seacoast in the east. It barely tolerates men who try to descend it, and any man who tried to ascend it and into the heart of the land would be brutally rebuffed. The river does not flow, but debouches insanely over a landscape which resembles a titanic slag heap spewed out by some tremendous subterranean smelter. It is a world which looks as hell might if hell's fires were quenched. The river roars angrily over this chaos and spills its fury almost at will over the land, spreading out to envelop as much of the broken debris as it can reach. In 5 days, we covered 100 miles. We had soon given up any attempt to count the rapids. They were often continuous for many miles at a stretch, and the interludes of calm water were so rare and therefore so startling that they impressed us more than the rapids would have done on any other rivers. Although the season was too advanced for men in a canoe, we had no choice but to travel, whether through rain or into the hatred of sleet. At first, we feared our slim load of food would not be enough, but soon we were thankful that we carried no more weight with us. Many times we were saved from destruction in the shallow violence of the rapids only because the canoe was so light that she could meet the hungry caress of the rocks without feeling their teeth. I remember only 2 things out of that ordeal not connected with the hazardous confusion of rocks and boiling masses of water. The first of these is the memory of 2 great caribou bucks standing on the summit of a hill and facing each other defiantly with the silent challenge of the rut in their tense attitude. I saw them for only an instant before the ever-present storm scud whipped out over our heads and blotted out the images of the 2 magnificent beasts. The second thing I remember was a cairn of rocks on the shore, which we mistook for a stone man. During our first 5 days on the river, we had seen no sign that men had ever come down this torrent. When we saw the Inukok, we fought our way free of the current and landed to inspect it more closely. It was no stone man, but only a little heap of flat stones piled over the grave of a child. Wolves or foxes had nosed aside some of the rocks, and the white bones were scattered about in the gravel. Only those 2 memories remain. The rest is a nightmare confusion of black, curling waves, of white driven spray, and the half seen glimpses of evil, dark rocks under the keel of the canoe. Slewiaza brought us out of the barrens, but it did so with savagery and with the clear warning that it would tolerate no attempt at a return. Late in September, the canoe, shrunken now by the ponderous swells of Hudson Bay, began feeling the sting of salt spray in her wounds. It was almost the end. There remained a day and a night when we fought with an offshore gale and a blinding snow blizzard, and for a while held onto the canoe and to our lives only because we found a reef and were able to stand waist deep in the frigid green waters for the long hours until the tide changed and the wind dropped. We turned north and at last found refuge behind the long yellow dunes of Eskimo Point. Our night on the reef had made it obvious that we could not hope to navigate 100-odd miles south to Churchill in our crippled canoe. After a week at Eskimo Point, we were picked up by a wandering Royal Canadian Air Force plane, and then for the last time I looked down on the immutable face of the Barrens and watched it recede from me, carrying with it the people I had known in its depths. My journey was over, but I was still tied to the Barrens, not by the simple web of memories alone, but by something more powerful. There was and is an abiding affection in my heart for the men and women of the plains who lent me their eyes, so that I was privileged to look backward through the dark void of dead years and to see not only the relics of forgotten times, but also to see into the minds and the thoughts of the men of those times. It was a great gift I had from the people and one that deserved a repayment. During the years which followed my return to the cities, I tried to keep myself informed of the Ihalmuit's progress. Avidly, I searched for the stray scraps of news that trickled out of the barrens, and I managed to piece together these so that I was able to trace the history of the people after my time. And what I discovered shocked me inexpressibly. When I left the Barrens, I had naively believed that the Hamlet would know no more black days, nor be left to struggle with their dark fates unaided by us. I was sure that the work done by Franz, by Andy, and myself, and our careful reports to the government would have made it quite impossible for the monumental neglect of half a century to be continued. I was wrong. Here is the epilogue to the story of the Hamlet. During the winter and early spring of 1949 to 1950, starvation again struck at the people with undiminished ferocity. And that starvation would have been fatal but for one accident. It happened that a freelance photographer and newspaper writer wandered into the Northern Barrens in March of 1950, and he found the northern cousins of the Ihalmuit, the Ihalmuit, in desperate straits from famine. His story was given screaming headlines in several influential newspapers, and in late April, the RCAF was instructed to fly emergency supplies to the Ihalmuit and Ihalmuit. Food was taken in, and shortly afterwards, news released from the authorities painted this humanitarian effort so brilliantly that no reader thought to ask why this dramatic rescue had been necessary. No one thought of the long winter when, once more abandoned, the Ihalmuit had struggled with death. No one asked why that agony had been allowed to repeat its brutal pattern once more. That it should have been permitted to happen is even more incredible in view of the fact that during the summer of 1949, an epidemic of poliomyelitis struck the Ihalmuit, and the authorities belatedly visited the Little Hills country, though not in time to prevent the disease from taking its toll. First, the only child born to the people that year, a son of Mickey, was dead. Itkut, the youngest wife of Kakami, was dead. Haumik, the mother of young Inoti, and Hikwa, the old master hunter, were crippled. And Hikwa's son, Ohotuk, was dead. Hikwa and Haumik were evacuated to Churchill for treatment. They lived, but despite the fact that government agents had been seen with their own eyes how bad things were, the Ihalmuit were once again abandoned. Then, in the spring of 1950, a commercial fishing company supplied by air from Churchill, moved to Newelton Lake. This company needed only one thing to make its fishing venture a success. It had the fish, for Newelton is an untouched reservoir of gigantic lake trout and whitefish, and that was cheap labor. Now the Canadian government is most anxious to encourage the spread of industries in the Arctic. So what was more natural than to help out the new company by turning over to it the remaining Ihalmuit? In the summer, the RCMP flew to the Little Hills country, picked up the Ihalmuit despite their efforts to resist, and delivered them into the benevolent hands of the fishing company. The news release pointed out that this was done solely to benefit the Eskimos, who would now be able to protect themselves from the future disasters by assisting the white men. I've not been able to discover all the details of what followed, but I know that the fishing company failed and that the Ihalmuit, having once more given up their essential struggle to the land, were cast loose in a year's time to readjust as best they might to the old ways again. It was a repetition of the trader-Eskimo relationship of the 30s, but this time repeated under government sponsorship. It's not the end of the paragraph, but the last thing in my reading of a third of this chapter before was my aborted attempt to summarize probably the most powerful scene in one of the great artistic video games of all time, the kind of game sometimes known as a walking simulator, a very highly polished kind of interactive film that makes it interactive without wrecking the artistic cinematic integrity of it. It's called What Remains of Edith Finch, about a young girl who goes back to the empty home of her family. The home is long abandoned. It's in the Pacific Northwest somewhere. Highly artistic family, much tragedy, and she goes through the house little by little, remembering the stories of all of the deceased or vanished family members. And I may have summarized this at some point in reading the book before, possibly with the memories of fish, but the most powerful scene is of a young boy in the family who's highly artistic, has a hard time adapting to the outside world, to some extent like a devoted video game player, you could say. Although in the game he doesn't play video games, and his mother tries really, really hard to get him into the world of reality and outside of the wonderful world of his imagination, and eventually lands him a job at a local fish factory. And it's a wonderfully creative, interactive scene where on one level you control the boy himself at a repetitive fish factory machine, where over and over and over and over and over again you move the dead fish to a saw blade and cut their heads off, and then move the body of the fish to a repository where they'll be canned later. And the boy, while he's doing this, it's so repetitive, he builds an imaginary world for himself where he's a prince in a royal fantasy land, medieval, courtly, magical. And increasingly this fantasy world begins to take over his life, his time at the factory, and you can almost see what's coming, and you're still guiding his hand, cutting the heads off the fish over and over and over again, but also increasingly you're controlling his imagination, his imaginary land in this fantasy world. And the final scene is you control this boat, and there's music and there's artwork. It's sort of overlaid over the work in the fish factory, and you know in advance that he died tragically, but you don't know the details. And so the whole time you see that saw blade, and you're trying to keep control of the fish, even as you're trying to control the boat on this river. And you eventually find yourself at the end of the river, and you're led into this castle in the heart of the kingdom, and you're being led to the throne room, and You're going to be marrying a princess, and you're to be crowned king. And then all of a sudden, you're led into the throne room to fanfare and music and celebration, and you're going up to the throne to be crowned king, and all of a sudden, you can see what's going to happen, and you go up, and the king and the queen are waiting for you, and all you have to do is bow down your head to have the crown put on your head, and you see what he chooses to do, and he's in his fantasy world. He's bowing down to have the crown put on his head, and in the real world, he's bowing down to have the saw blade in the fish factory cut his head off. As you can tell, it's pretty heartbreaking. You can probably find on YouTube. You don't have to play the game. You can find a 10-minute video of that scene with some keywords. And What Remains of Edith Finch is the name of the game. And fish factory scene or something. I recommend it. It's much more impactful if you're actually playing the whole game and you're controlling it yourself. But you can see what I'm talking about by looking it up. And I can see the Ihalmuit in that sort of increasingly almost fantasy world of their past, having to confront the reality of the present in a fish factory and death and Ahoto's suicidal thoughts from the previous chapter. It all ties together, the interconnectivity of life, reality, and art. Anyway, based on how I feel as I was summarizing that, I was increasingly certain that I wasn't telling the story for the second time. Well, maybe I just did it in a lot more detail this time, but I'll get back to the book now. I think I'm rereading the last sentence, but I'll do it anyway. It was a repetition of the trader-Eskimo relationship of the 30s, but this time repeated under government sponsorship. In 1951, the Ihalmuit were again, and probably for the final and fatal time, forgotten in the depths of their land. The official government statement covering the first part of this episode is so interesting that I have included it in full. Here it almost looks like the end of the chapter, but it's not. There's an actual copy of the article. I'm not going to do what I sometimes have done with his sketches from the book and include it in the heading of the chapter, although I could do that. I'll just read it, acknowledging that it's a photograph of the actual news article. Starving Eskimos may be evacuated 130 miles by air. Ottawa, April 25th. Parentheses, CP, probably Canadian Press. A band of primitive Eskimos facing starvation in the Lake Anadai district in the Northwest Territories may be evacuated by air to Lake Newelton, 130 miles away. Officials of the Northwest Territories Council in Ottawa said today plans are under consideration for the complete rehabilitation of the small band, believed to be the last surviving remnants of the caribou-eater Eskimos. First reports of starvation among the Eskimos, estimated to number slightly more than 30, reached Ottawa a few weeks ago, and a plane load of food was flown into the district by the RCAF. At Churchill, that's Manitoba, today, Major Blank, I guess they don't want to have his last name, or at least Mowat doesn't, Army medical officer at Fort Churchill said the Eskimos are on the verge of starvation. He examined them after being flown into the district to return an Eskimo woman treated at Churchill for illness. Major Blank said the Eskimos' inadequate diet has shown up in various ways, including skin diseases. Lacking the proper facilities to help them get food, he is sending in drugs to the district 300 miles northwest of Churchill as the next best thing. The Eskimos are in a hard-to-get-at spot that lacks adequate facilities. This report is typical of the publicity white men of this continent have given to our efforts to assist the Arctic natives, and as such it deserves close examination. But such an examination quickly dispels the impression of our benevolent zeal as guardians and protectors of the Eskimos. It appears as a shameless effort to avoid the blame for a great and continuing evil, an effort to lay our conscience at rest. The second paragraph of the release makes brave reading if you are not aware that the, quote, plans, unquote, mentioned were those concerning the fishery at Newelton. And if you are not aware that these plans came to nothing and no further attempts to, quote, rehabilitate, unquote, the Ihalmuit have been implemented as I write this in December of 1951. The third paragraph is even more startling, for it states that first reports of starvation amongst the Ihalmuit were not received until the spring of 1950. It is difficult to understand how the reports written by Andy and myself and submitted in 1947 and 1948 directly to the government, branch responsible for Eskimo administration, could have been forgotten. Nevertheless, they must have been forgotten, as was Franz's report in the spring of 1947, and as was the action taken by the government itself in that year. Much has evidently been forgotten. You should hear comment on frequently how uninspired and unengaged government employees can often be, and the famous saying, close enough for government work. Capitalism is imperfect, but competition at its best, when appropriately regulated, can bring out the best, and there's no competing government agencies for the benefit of tribal peoples, where one agency that does a better job of assisting them will get the credit and the promotion and the raises in pay. In the event of these discrepancies coming to light, however, the final paragraph provides an explanation and an excuse. The Eskimos are in a hard-to-get-at spot that lacks adequate facilities. It is not our fault, then, if all our good intentions fail. Our consciences may rest at ease. We've done our best. Perhaps. But my conscience will not rest. I have spoken of the debt I owe the people, and this debt alone would prevent me from accepting oblivion as the answer to the problem of what fate awaits our native races. Refusing to accept this answer, I have written this book in an attempt to give form and substance to the voices which spoke to me from the graying rock heaps under Kinatua. The people lent me their eyes so that I might see what white men have tried not to see. Now I, in turn, have lent the people my voice so that white men shall hear the words of the Ihalmuit, the words the Ihalmuit cannot speak for themselves. There's a corollary there, a connection. The government and the white peoples, as a living race, in relation to this dying race, very much like, to me, the description of the living family and friends of Ivan Ilyich in the death of Ivan Ilyich, and his experience as a dying man, and the self-justifying disconnect that the living find themselves adopting in order to go on living and to be comfortable. It may be that I have spoken too late, and so have done no more than to remember the great days of a race which is gone. But the story of the Ihalmuit is not theirs alone, since much of what I have written about them holds true for many thousands of Indians and Eskimos across the whole length and breadth of the continent. If I have only succeeded in writing an epitaph for the Ihalmuit, perhaps their tragedy can nevertheless be made to bear fruit, though it be a bitter fruit. Perhaps it will help us look with brave new honesty into the lives of those who dwell by hidden rivers and by frozen coasts and in the depths of forests. If this should come to pass, then I will have paid my debt. It is not enough to have chronicled the destruction of certain men. It is not enough to have been harshly critical of my own society and to have described the injustices and the crimes of stupidity and omission which must lie at our door. There remains the question of what can be done so that the tragedy of the Ihalmuit will not become the fatal pattern for all those who dwell within the cold sweep of the north. Solutions to the problem may be complex, but any solution must be based on one primary act. And here I want to comment on the trap, I think, that most people, including myself, fall into when it comes to writing or, worse, commenting online on Twitter or on Facebook and righteously commenting about the injustices of this or that, the Trump administration or the Ukrainian war, and feeling like once you spout it off moralistically and said what's right, you clap your hands together and feel like you've done enough instead of doing the actual hard work of finding solutions to complex problems. We must first of all and immediately help the Eskimos and Indians escape from their now chronic condition of malnutrition and even outright starvation. And we must do this not as a dole, but by helping them to feed themselves. That was in italics. Charity is as fatal to primitive people as it is to civilized ones. And here I have to say that famous phrase, which is very appropriate. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, and teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Lots of layers to that, given what's been said about fish. And of course, I can bring Jesus and the connection to fish into it. The continuous giving of basic sustenance brings about a dependency which is often mortal to the spirit. Furthermore, the kind of food we have so far provided for native peoples has not been food, but rather a slow poison which destroys the body through malnutrition, almost as certainly as outright starvation would. No, we must not give food. What we must do is give the natives the means of procuring their own food from the land which is theirs. It should be clear enough that flour and baking powder are no substitutes. The northern lands do not themselves provide food of this nature. The kind of food they can provide is meat. The question is, how can we ensure that the northern people have meat in plenty? Let us see what has happened to the once abundant supplies of red meat in the north. The fate of the deer has been the fate of all. Some of the most important animals have already almost vanished. The muskox, the narwhals, and the right whales. And for the rest, they have all been terribly diminished, so that the land and sea no longer raise their food crop for men as they once did. Here I find myself thinking about Daniel Quinn's description of the pre-civilized world, the world beyond 10 or 15,000 years ago, when the world was inhabited by thousands of tribes of taker peoples, and how that world, not inhabited sort of parasitically by civilization, but by tribal peoples who knew how to live in peace with the land, about how the entire world was, in a very real sense, the Eden the Bible mysteriously refers to, where the earth was just provided what people needed when there was an overpopulation and humanity's toxic belief that the only thing that truly matters is human beings, and not just human beings, but civilized human beings. The land has been bled so freely that it now can lay just claim to that ominous name, the Barrens. The sea, too, has been bled, and is being bled. The sealing fleets along the eastern coasts have done yeoman work. The whalers have long since destroyed the great mammals which once came into Hudson Bay and into all the narrow waters at the top of the continent. And with the passing of the whales, whole tribes of Eskimos have also vanished. Nor is the bloodletting at an end. The walrus, which were once the most important of the sea beasts of the coast Eskimos, have been seriously reduced in numbers, largely by the RCMP, by traders, and by missionaries, who annually slaughter fantastic numbers of walrus in order to feed dog teams that are 3 or 4 times as big as they need to be. At Churchill, a commercial plant to process white whales, beluga they are more often called, was established as recently as 1949 with full government approval. The meat of these beasts is to be shipped south to feed foxes on our fur ranches or to provide fertilizer for our gardens. On the islands of the Arctic, many Eskimos have been forced to subsist largely on fish because of the disappearance of sea mammals, and now even the fish are being taken from them. In 1949, a new fishery was opened by Nova Scotian ships in an area where the Eskimos were almost completely dependent on fish. Had it not been for the presence of Army personnel who took a determined stand against this flagrant robbery, this fishery, which was also fully sanctioned by the government, despite the outraged protests of several Arctic specialists, would have brought famine to these Eskimos. Here I should bring up the idea, frequently misused by quote unquote civilized people, of survival of the fittest. A very misunderstood evolutionary concept. It began with Darwin and the origin of the species. Just because you have a cancerous predator at the top of the food chain that devours everything doesn't mean that cancerous predator is a successful victor. The picture is the same throughout the North. When any financial advantage can accrue to us through the destruction of the lifeblood of the Northern people, we do not scruple to destroy. The authorities talk of conservation, while at the same time, one branch of government is accepting thousands of dollars from sportsmen to fly them in government planes to the heart of caribou country, where they can kill the people's food for sheer sport alone. The authorities enact game laws, which reserve the dwindling numbers of meat-producing wild animals for recreational use by white men, for sport and trophy hunting, while effectively denying the use of these animals to the native people who need them for sheer physical survival. There's a good portrayal of this in Mowat's book, which was turned into the Disney movie, Never Cry Wolf, which is a fictional story based on reality highly. The great actor Brian Dennehy in the early 80s plays a white sportsman who flies into the Arctic and meets the scientist who's the main character, and at first sort of befriends the scientist, but later starts to seem like a villain who's just there to hunt caribou and wolves. Gotta watch that movie again. In support of the decimation of the mammals in the North, certain experts claim that the Eskimos and Indians must, in the long run, learn to eat our food if they are to ever become part of our way of life. This justifies the wanton destruction of the Arctic food. But does it? Eskimos and Indians will always live largely in the North, and so they will always be able to maintain their eating habits as they are, providing there is meat to eat. More important, they will always need the specific nutriments found in fat and meat. It is senseless to say the northern natives must change their diet, as senseless as suggesting that our race should abandon the basic products of our land in favor of strange foods to be imported from a far distant region. The question is, what can we do to restore the food we have stolen from the mouths of the northern peoples? And the answer is that we can do everything needful. The caribou provide a clear example of what might be done. If it were possible to overrule the selfish interests of white men, it would be relatively easy to make the barren plains again produce the food which men must have if they are to survive in the land. At the moment, and by the tacit admission of the government, the deer are close to the fatal level beyond which a further reduction in numbers will doom them to extinction. But they have not yet passed the point of no return. They could still be preserved. And I know this to be true, for I have spent 2 years studying this problem in the field and as a scientist. There are enough deer left so that if given full protection, the species could stage a quick comeback, and there is no good reason why this resurgence should not take place. The true value of caribou lies not only in their contributions to the well-being of the Barrens Eskimos, but in the fact that they are of equal importance to the continual survival of about 40,000 high forest Indians, and to the majority of the 8,000 surviving Eskimos across the whole Canadian Arctic. All modern Eskimos are descended from caribou hunting people, even though many Inuit now depend largely on the products of the sea. In fact, almost all Eskimos of our time would willingly and gratefully turn to the deer for their support if the deer were available. Unlike the buffalo, who were fated to become extinct because they contended with us for lands we coveted, the deer live in a land no settler will ever wish to seize. The barrens will never grow wheat or beef or cattle. They will grow one food crop and one alone, the deer. Barrens can support a tremendous population of deer, perhaps as high as 5 million head. Once they were this numerous, and in order to return to this high level, they need only protection. Not from wolves, not from the legitimate and normal appetites of the natives, but from us. Directly, they need protection from white trappers and hunters, and indirectly, they need protection from the manufacturing companies who make a good part of their profits from the sale of astronomical amounts of ammunition and from the sale of repeating rifles. If we were to place an absolute prohibition on the killing of deer by white men, and if we were to restrict the sale of ammunition and the types of weapons sold to the natives, the deer would do the rest. We should go farther and absolutely prohibit sports hunting of any species of animal in the region where these species could contribute to the well-being of native peoples. There might well be a period of increasing hardship while the Indian and Eskimo hunters adjust to a limited killing potential, but they are not fools and they would adjust so that their kill becomes a valid one. That reference to gun and weapons and restrictions on gun and weapons makes me want to bring up the NRA and what a toxic force it's become in America, and how dare anybody impinge on any rights of gun ownership or gun use. It's more about gun ownership. Seems like the NRA doesn't necessarily have a problem with hunting regulations as long as it serves to protect game for the hunters. The futile and expensive stopgaps that we now advocate would no longer be required. The idiotic system of paying bounty on wolves would not be needed. The periodic disease epidemics, which wipe out overly large populations of natural predators in the north, would do the job for us, as it has always done. Nature can and does manage this control very well. We are the one predator she cannot control. We must control ourselves. And it's in the short term. Farley Mowat's still operating in the past, where, as Daniel Quinn might have put it, prior to the days of the publication of the book Silent Spring, which, in his view, was sort of the dawn of the human race beginning to realize fully that nature will eventually put controls on us. So a decade before that, Farley Mowat may have still been believing that human beings, civilization, does truly have control over nature. Many agents of the government have complained, sadly, that it seems impossible for the Indians and Eskimos to accommodate the modern world. The Aklavik Eskimos at the mouth of the Mackenzie River are an exception. Fortuitous circumstances, not any direct help from us, gave those people a fair chance to adapt themselves to our way of life, and they made the most of their opportunity. But why have not all the northern natives been as successful? Because men with starved bodies have starved minds as well. Starved intellects do not respond well to difficult tasks, and the adjustment of a primitive race to our civilization is exceedingly difficult. There's a little bit of a tangent, but very short-term starvation, hunger, over the period of, days or weeks, can have a very pronounced benefit on the ability of the mind to function well. It's why what I came to on my own and what I've learned other people have come to indirectly, the idea of intermittent fasting, and fasting generally has some purchase. Fasting has some purchase in the spiritual realm because of its lightening and clarifying effect on the mind. And that's one of the reasons I came to it on my own. It's ridiculous to assume that human beings, if they don't eat for 24 hours, become the kind of stupid, grumpy people we assume human beings always become if they don't have 3 meals a day. There's no way human beings could evolve if they didn't have a boost in mental capacity when hunger faced them. but we're so consistently fed and consistently prevented from feeling starvation that we can't really comprehend that except in the very tiny realm of intermittent starvation. Intermittent fasting, sorry. Not that they aren't related. All right, where did I leave off? But well-fed men are capable of understanding and of coping with new and unfamiliar problems. The Eskimos stand out as being particularly adaptable people with a remarkable aptitude for absorbing new ideas, mechanical and otherwise. Necessity is the mother of invention. What's more necessary than surviving starvation and feeding your family? Freed of the incubus of malnutrition and its handmaiden disease, our Eskimos are capable of quick and sane adjustment to the conditions of the white man's world, as the Aklavik people have abundantly demonstrated. They cannot, of course, step from igloo into office overnight, even supposing that this was what they wished to do. Yeah, I'm sure they would love the idea of jumping into office building cubicles. The northern natives as a whole can be made part of our scheme of things only by the expedient of employing them as brute labor. Slave labor would be a better term. And in many cases, this is what we have attempted. That makes me think of the idea of the justification for genuine slavery in America, finding ways to convince yourself that that's what black people are perfectly adapted for, and really it's a charity for them. Again, it's a kind of necessity is the mother of invention. If slavery is necessary for your economic model and helping your family stay alive, you're going to invent a view of black people that serves you. The better answer lies in a gradual transition based on a solid foundation of economic independence of a sort that is compatible with the present knowledge and experience of the people. It sounds like a tall order, yet a solution to it has been known to the governments of Canada and the United States for the last 30 years and was actually developed by them. I am referring to the reindeer grazing scheme, which was originally begun in Alaska and which was copied by the Canadians. In brief, the plan was to import Asiatic reindeer, very similar to caribou, and train natives to act as herdsmen. Maybe they're like the caribou, but more adapted to being herd animals, animal husbandry than living on their own. Each native village was to have its own herd, and these herds were to make the people independent as far as a supply of protein was concerned, while at the same time providing them with a saleable cash crop. The scheme developed rather strangely. In Alaska, it fell into the hands of certain white men who exploited it for their own gain. Of course, in Canada, it was begun purely as an experiment and has remained no more than an experiment limited in its effects to a tiny handful of Eskimos near the Mackenzie Delta. Nevertheless, it has shown that it could be an answer to the problem of economic independence for every Eskimo in Canada. There is only one really valid reason why it has not been extended. I don't know what he's about to say, but there's a clear sort of wait for it vibe after that sentence. I'm sure he feels like the groundwork has been laid for the answer. It has been strenuously opposed by important interests whose voices are clearly heard in high places. Yeah, damn straight he laid the groundwork for that. These opponents, the strongest of whom are connected with the beef industry, have held the field with their contention that Canada could not afford a reindeer industry. Yet it can be easily demonstrated that the initial cost of extending the reindeer industry, and industry it could well be, would be rapidly repaid, both in direct returns and in the indirect returns which would result from the money we might save and which we now largely waste in blind efforts to assist the Eskimos with share. So many examples of that. The alcohol industry crushing the marijuana industry because marijuana was a drug that competed with alcohol a century or more ago. And the gasoline fossil fuel industry trying to crush the idea of climate change and green energy because it's a threat to the gasoline and fossil fuel industry. Whoever's in power makes tons of money in power off of where their position is going to find a way to burn everything to the ground rather than accept change. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There are approximately 2 million square miles of the Arctic which are completely or largely suitable for reindeer raising. The caribou occupy much, but not all, of this area. But the preservation of these wild deer would not provide a serious obstacle to the introduction of reindeer. The introduction of reindeer herding as an industry throughout the Arctic would accomplish two things. First, it would assist the caribou and the sea mammals in providing northern men with the kind of food they require. Secondly, it would provide a sound economic basis for the inevitable transition which the northern people must undergo or perish. The Eskimos, and many northern Indians, would be producing saleable commodities. The world today is a meat-hungry world and will remain one for as far ahead as we can see. In Alaska, reindeer meat is widely used by white men and was even shipped south to Seattle, where it was distributed and sold as a luxury food until the pressure of the U.S. meat lobby forced the trade to be discontinued. And of course, the Eskimos of the Canadian Arctic could do as well, or better, if they have access to a great ocean port, though one that is at present so little used as to be a serious financial embarrassment to us, at Churchill. From Churchill runs the shortest sea route to Europe, and in Europe, animal protein is desperately needed. It might prove economically sound to establish a meatpacking plant at Churchill, not to prepare beluga for fox food, but to prepare reindeer and perhaps caribou meat, if the herds prosper for shipment abroad. The plan seems reasonable, for at this moment we are canning horse meat in the central Canadian prairies, shipping it 1,000 miles by rail, then transshipping it by lake and ocean freighter to Europe, where it is sold for human consumption at a good profit. And I feel like Mowat here isn't fully addressing one of the really important cultural things. It's not fully, he's indirectly facing it, but not fully, which is just the overpowering civilizational belief that tribal peoples such as the Ihalmuit, the inland Eskimos, who could live the way they have been living off caribou or beluga or walrus, the fundamental civilizational belief by just too many people that those people are living in the wrong way and they need to be civilized and they need to be brought around to civilized way of living. And if they aren't doing it and it takes disaster to force them to do it, then so be it. In the long run, it's for the greater good. It's like Christian missionaries going into tribal communities and destroying the community because you're bringing them to Christ, and whatever it takes, it's the right choice because saving their souls is the only important thing. It's like Donald Trump making money and the Republican Party winning. It's the only thing that matters. And if you want to make those omelets, you got to break some effing eggs. More than that, we could arrange to ship meat south from Churchill on the Hudson Bay Railway, which operates its southbound trains at heavy loss, and make the refrigerated meat available throughout Canada. Perhaps it would provide a certain amount of competition with our cattle raising industry, but I hardly think this would cause much annoyance to our general population. The interior barrens on the west coast of Hudson Bay could support a minimum of 200,000 reindeer, and the annual crop of meat from such a herd would be quite large enough to bring a full measure of economic independence to the entire present Eskimo population of the Central Arctic. Before I leave this point of economic stability, I must mention the fact that the need for this condition is apparently accepted in principle by the authorities, who have throughout the years suggested such ideas as an eider duck, EIDERDUCK, eider duck industry, or white fox. Oh, it's a kind of duck. or white fox fur ranching on the barrens. These suggestions and others have been put forward over the last 2 decades, but no serious attempt has been made to implement any one of them. They have been made purely and simply to uh, have been made. They have been purely and simply cover schemes. I cannot honestly guarantee that reindeer and caribou plans are certain of meeting all requirements, but they are a potentially effective method for achieving the results which the government has so frequently insisted it wishes to achieve. With the establishment of a sound economy, the passageway from the world of the natives to our world would be open, and they could cross the void which now separates them from us, if they so desired. To date, we have tried only one method of bridging the gap, and that is to carry the northern peoples into our complex and unfamiliar life at one gigantic leap. Missionaries, for example, go to the Arctic and suffer like martyrs so that in a year or a decade they can make professing Christians out of some heathen tribe. It is too great a leap. The so-called converts have no more idea of what lies behind the ideas they mouth than we have of what lies behind the eyes of God. Brave men, but dangerous men. The missionaries were also entrusted by the government with almost all the meager educational work being done in the north. In most of the church schools, the Eskimos were taught the singing of hymns and the saying of prayers. But they learned little else, and what they did learn was useless to them, for it was not applicable to the physical realities of their present lives. Confused and baffled, they suffer for this attempt to educate them, since they learned only enough to make them feel vaguely dissatisfied, vaguely feel vague dissatisfaction, without understanding how to bring about the changes which were needed. However, the missionary school system is advantageous to us, for it relieves the government of the need of spending tax money on the project, and it is beyond normal criticism since few of us dare or wish to criticize the selfless efforts of the dedicated men who are our missionaries. Clearly, what is required is to provide native teachers who have been rationally and intelligently trained and who can then go back to a healthy, unfettered people and teach what they have learned. The essence of the matter is to use no force. The northern natives would be in a position to embrace voluntarily and with understanding the white men's religious, economic, and political creeds if they so desire. And the church in the north could at least claim their new members were just that and not the bemused dupes which native Christians now represent. Maybe there's some kind of corollary example here. I think the present day is making it look less true, but imagine, if you will, a world in which China and its government system completely takes over the world, and America is relegated to a backwater, backwards country, and China just has so much power that it survival of the fittest, and they come in and they just try to dominate and bring these poor heathen Americans into their way of living. And just I can imagine how Americans will react to that. Never mind MAGA Americans. How dare you treat us like stupid native peoples? We're Americans. We're the top of the food chain. Uh, we're not the losers. We're the victors. Not the bemused dupes which native Christians now represent. It seems to me that this is a sane point of view, but it is not shared by the missions. You're doing assuming that people are fucking sane. For they have fought and are fighting still to keep the education of the northern natives in their own hands. It is a fight which is made more dangerous to the Eskimos by the violent competition between opposing religious groups, who often engage in most unchristian strife using the souls and bodies of the natives as their pawns in their strange battles. Once again, I recommend the movie Black Robe. Certainly, the northern races can hope for little real opportunity to come to terms with our civilization until we extend to them the purely material facilities which are needed: proper schools, proper medical facilities, preferably with native doctors, and a fair and honest economic treatment. These are the essentials. To give a dying man a cup of water may be laudable, but to let that man die when it is in our power to prevent it is despicable. In effect, we have been doling out cups of water to dying people in the Arctic and have been free with self-praise of this benevolence. Surely we must possess a peculiarly facile turn of mind when we can virtuously condemn the cruelties perpetrated in other countries, while at the same time we avert our eyes from the cruelties we ourselves continue to condone in our own land. Certainly we are stupid and short-sighted, for the harm we do is not done alone to the Eskimos and Indians, but it is done to ourselves as well. That's final chapter, but end of the chapter, but final comment. The hypocrisy of looking at other countries and judging them, and then seeing ourselves totally differently. As I don't know, recently, Elise Stefanik, the head of the Republican Party in the House, going and preaching democracy abroad, while at home her party is working actively to destroy democracy. Just how what she's up against. I'm sure she's convinced herself that there's no hypocrisy there. The capacity for self-justification is ridiculous in human beings. We're not fundamentally rational creatures like we pretend. Law number 1 of the Laws of Human Nature in Robert Greene's book, The Laws of Human Nature. End of stream.